Ever since Citroën's bankruptcy in the mid-70s and consequent takeover by Peugeot, the debate of what was the last true Citroën has never subsided. Every time a new model came out, whether it was the XM or the Saxo, all the purists would gather round and decide if it was a proper Citroën or just a Peugeot with some chevrons on it. And you may ask, what's a proper Citroën? Well, for that you're going to have to watch the last video where I deal with that subject. In this video, I'm going to list candidates for what could be the last proper Citroën. Small caveat before we continue. When I said a proper Citroën, it's shorthand. The title probably would have been more accurate if it was what does a Citroën need in order to keep purists happy and not be derided as soon as it comes out. But that's not as catchy, and I need something more clickbaity, because if you've ever been on my channel before, you've seen how pathetic my views are, and God knows I could use some more. But either way, I'm going to address what a proper Citroën is at the end of the video, so please stay tuned. Now, for those of you who didn't see the last video, there's a link up there. You can go and watch it. I'll wait. But to summarise, I established what were the three criteria that Citroëns should have to be considered a proper Citroën, and they should comply with 2 out of those 3 criteria. They were innovation, being distinct from the competition, and having some Citroën quirkiness. And I gave some examples in the previous video, blah blah blah, doesn't matter. For this video, I'm going to choose various models, these are my choices, of candidates for the last proper Citroëns, and we're going to go in chronological order. And that means starting off with the Citroën CX. The Citroën CX fulfills the criteria of what is a proper Citroën just for the fact that it was the last Citroën to be developed and manufactured by the company while it was independent. On that alone, it's a proper Citroën. Now, on a personal level, I have quite a history with the Citroën CX. I can say I grew up in them. My dad had about 11 of them, though some of them were parts cars. And I adore it to death, and I think it's probably the best car ever made. So I am partial to them. But let's judge it on its own merits. So in regards to innovation, it was not an innovative car. It wasn't. Doesn't matter how much of a purist you are, you have to admit that. For example, the name CX actually comes from the French abbreviation for drag coefficient. It was meant to be a very aerodynamic car. That was its big thing. But that was an evolution of the DS. In fact, the CX was the DS's successor. So you can't really pin the aerodynamics as a massive innovation if it was just really an evolution of what came before. Some people may point to the self-centering steering, or DIRAVI, which stands for Direction à Rappel Asservie, but that was actually introduced in the Citroën SM. It was not an innovation of the CX. Where the CX was supposed to be innovative was under the bonnet. You see, the DS was probably one of the most groundbreaking, most innovative cars of all time, but where it fell down was exactly what power did. It had really evolutions of the old traction Avant engines, which were engines from the 30s. The CX was supposed to have a rotary engine, but that fell through in about 1973 with the oil crisis, and suddenly petrol prices quadrupled. A rotary engine does about 27 litres per 100 kilometres, as Citroën found out firsthand with the GS birotor, which was quickly scrapped. So Citroën then had to shoehorn some 4-cylinder engines, and I say shoehorned because it also had to have the spare tyre under there as well. So it's very, very, even though it was a massive bonnet, there wasn't that much room beneath. But yeah, that's Citroën for you. So yeah, not that innovative at all. Was it distinct from the competition? Very much so. The emphasis on aerodynamics, on comfort, on refinement, really was something you didn't find in its direct competitors. If not for that, then just the fact that it had hydropneumatic suspension makes it distinct from the competition, because no one else offered that. Actually, I tell a lie, the Maserati Quattroporte 2 offered that, and so did the Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, at least on the rear suspension from 1968 onwards, if I'm not mistaken. But either way, you can't exactly say that those were direct competitors to the CX, so definitely distinct from the competition. As for the quirkiness, the Citroën quirkiness, well, this is probably where the car has the biggest check mark for criteria for being a proper Citroën. Now, probably this Citroën CX is the Citroën with the most Citroën weirdness ever made. Hands down, easily. I mean, where to start? First off, I'm probably going to miss things because there were so many. First off, what the driver experienced. In Series 1 CXs, there was a rotating drum for the speedometer and the rev counter, if you were lucky enough to have one. My dad's cars never had any of them because they're all low spec. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Rotating drums that are also on the GS, I believe. Instead of regular stalks, you had these modules, these pods on either side called lunule. Incredibly clever things because they were all at your fingertips. You could do lots of things without taking your hands off the steering wheel. They were very clever. Then, for example, I remember the trigger door handles. They were some of my favorite features. Instead of having, usual pull-out gesture, you had these trigger door handles. Very ergonomical. And I remember when I was a boy, and of course with the door locked shut, I could pretend like I was flying my own spaceship and shooting things. Well, it definitely felt like a spaceship, no doubt. The word space, very important. It was so humongous in the back, you could probably put a letterbox on the outside and move in. It was that huge. In the center, I remember that my dad's Series 1 had the heater controls in the middle. Brilliant stuff. They were like these long throw levers, so it was a sense of occasion using them. Series 2 Citroëns had the radio there in a vertical position. A bit odd. It was sort of derided because of that, but it's a Citroën. It's always going to be derided, doesn't matter what. It had a concave rear window. Well, I should say the saloons did. The estates, or safaris as they were called in the UK, had a roof that had sort of like a step in it. I think that step was to make the interior capacity even larger. According to this article, the CX Estate is the second most capacious European car of all time, only beaten by the Citroën Traction Avant Commercial of the 30s, 40s and 50s. There might be another reason for it. It might be because you could put a third row of seats in the Familial cars. My dad also had a couple of them, and so whoever sat in the back didn't have their head touching the roof. I don't know. But either way, an absolutely quirky car, no doubt about it. But it only fulfills 2 of the 3 criteria, and it was the last proper Citroën built, definitely by any measure. So there's that. Keep that in mind. And for our next candidate, we're going to travel to 1982 and the boxy beauty that was the BX. I have to start off with a small personal note. It was my very first car. It was a Series 2, a 1991 model, and I absolutely loved that car to bits. It drove like nothing else. The BX was the successor to the GS, which by this time had evolved into the Citroën GSA. However, both cars would remain in production side by side until 1986, when Citroën finally put the GSA out of production. The BX is the car that sort of saved Citroën after the debacle of the 70s and the bankruptcy that followed, and how Peugeot had to bail them out. This was the car that sold in large enough numbers to make Citroën a viable brand again. It had to tone down some of the quirkiness. It also wasn't that innovative, to be honest with you. I mean, it had these lightweight composite panels that made the car not rust and also reduced the weight of the car. But that's not anything new. You think of Lotus and adding lightness and all that stuff. Having lightweight composites isn't exactly an innovation that can be attributed to the BX. Being distinct from the competition, well, it had that hydropneumatic system, and that's going to be sort of a cheat code. If it has a hydropneumatic system, then it's automatically distinct from the competition, because no other car, no other direct competitor offered such comfort that came from having that system. So that's an automatic check. Apart from that, I wouldn't say it was distinct from the competition at all. In fact, it was probably very similar to its stablemate, the Peugeot 405, even though that was a 3-box saloon and the BX had a hatch. Also, something else that was pretty weird about it was you could have it as a 1.1 litre engined petrol car. Well, this is mostly Southern Europe, for example, Italy and the country I live in, Portugal. It was released here as the BX TE, the TE standing for Très Économique, very economical, and it was. On the other hand, you could get a 19 GTI, which was, at least in this country, one of the most fire-breathing cars you could get for not too much money. As for quirkiness, well, the Series 1 did have weird dashboards, and in fact they also had the lunule, those pods that the Citroën CX had. So you can tick a box there. and it is a proper Citroën. Our next candidate, we go to 1989, the Citroën XM. It's a big Citroën, and big Citroëns usually have it a lot easier than other cars, and most Citroën purists tend to say big Citroëns are the proper Citroëns and all the rest aren't. The XM came out in 1989, as I just mentioned, to replace the CX, even though the CX Safari was manufactured until 1991, but that's neither here nor there. Just a small note. It was also very innovative because it had a new generation of hydroactive suspension. It was now electronically controlled, and you had extra spheres that could be cut out and make the car handle better and corner better and all that stuff. So that's something rather innovative. And of course, that hydropneumatic system also makes it distinct from the competition as well. Though, to be fair, when it came out, I do remember how people said it was trying to compete directly with the Germans, and to do that, it had, for example, a foot-operated handbrake, or parking brake, sorry, just like a Mercedes. So it was trying to be German, and that's something that my current car, the C5X7, is criticised for. And the XM, however, is lauded. So it just goes to show how Citroën purists can be a bit selectively short-sighted. So we've established that it was innovative and distinct from the competition. Just. Was it quirky? More or less. Now, apart from the single-spoke steering wheel, which was a Citroën trademark, there was very little in terms of quirkiness. Maybe the sun visor that was just for the rear view mirror could be a quirk, or that window in the back that stopped passengers, in the saloon car I should say, that stopped passengers from getting like a cold neck if you opened the rear hatch. Apart from that, there were little quirks to speak of, and by the time the Series 2 XM came out, that was made to be as conventional and as run-of-the-mill as possible. So, I don't know, I'll tick the box anyway, so that's a 3 out of 3 for the XM. My next candidate is going to be the first of the controversial ones. It's not just a Citroën Xantia, it's the Citroën Xantia Activa. Now, for those who don't know, the Activa was a car introduced in the mid-90s, and it had a system that actively counteracted body roll. So if you took a tight bend really fast, the car would naturally tilt outward, so to speak, and there were motors inside the car that kept it level. Now, this technology wasn't new. It was something that was kicking around and tested on DS's, as this photo demonstrates. However, this was the first time it was applied to a road car that the public could actually go and buy, and I don't think it's been applied on anything ever since, at least not in a run-of-the-mill family car. So first off, it's definitely innovative. That was a system never seen before, and I think never seen again. It's very distinct from the competition, again because of that system. It bleeds, these things sometimes bleed into one another, and it also had the hydropneumatic suspension. So that ticks 2 boxes. Was it Citroën quirky? I don't really think so. I think by the time the Xantia came along, Citroën had given up on the quirkiness, or at least maybe Peugeot had thrashed it out of them. I don't know. The Xantia, even though it's an absolutely lovely car, and I'd love to have one, I cannot say that it exudes with Citroën uniqueness. For my next candidate, another controversial one, and I'm going to jump to 2004 and talk about the first generation Citroën C4. You're probably thinking, what are you on about? It's just a hatchback that Citroën made to replace the Zara. Well, yes, but it also was innovative. First car I remember seeing with a lane departure warning system. I'm not sure if it was the first car ever, but either way, it was a hatchback. It was competing with Golfs and Focuses, or Foci. Don't know how to say it. Doesn't matter. Completely unique and never before seen system in a car like that. So, check for being innovative. Was it quirky? Definitely yes. It was the first Citroën to have the fixed centre hub in the steering wheel, just like my own C5. Very weird thing. Citroën could have done things differently, but they didn't. They did that. And it was also innovative as well at the same time, because the airbag, when it opened, it had something like a driver shape. Because the centre hub was always in the same position, it was never going to be tilted to one side or the other, didn't have to have a circular airbag. It would protect the driver a little bit better. Also, I find that having these controls in a fixed position instead of on the steering wheel and actually turning with the steering wheel means you always know where these buttons are. You never had to lost, oh, I've got to press it. No, they're where they are. So That's a funky, innovative thing that's very Citroën-y as well. That's a Citroën quirk. Now, for our final criterion, was it distinct from the competition? Not really, apart from the aesthetics really putting it apart, and the Citroën C4 Plurial being very different from everything else. I wouldn't say it was like a completely different proposition to what else was out there. It was the same sort of practical hatchback for taking a family. So yeah, I'm going to say no there. You can disagree, and if you do, top. That means it's a 3 out of 3, and I'm fine with that because I absolutely love the C4. On a personal note, I was going to buy one back in 2007, but it just didn't pan out. I ended up getting something else, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, definitely a proper Citroën. You weren't expecting that, were you? For our next car, 2005, and inevitably the C6, of course. How could a C6 not be a proper Citroën? Now, I've talked to some length about the C6 in a previous video, so I won't go on too much about it. But it was a car that was very derided, very unlucky. It was launched at a time where handling was the most important thing. Track times. Completely ridiculous. But anyway, let's get to it. Our criteria. Was it innovative? Oh, definitely. It's the first car in the world to have a safety system for pedestrians. If you hit an unfortunate pedestrian, the bonnet would pop up to cushion the pedestrian very slightly. And it was the first car, I think, to have a 4-star rating on Euro NCAP because of it, for pedestrian safety, I should say. It also took Citroën's own hydractive suspension system a step further for an even more incredible magic carpet ride. It also had a heads-up display, but I don't think it was the first car to have it, but it was definitely uncommon to see in cars of that class at the time in the mid-noughties. So definitely innovative. Was it distinct from the competition? My God, yes. As I said in the previous video, it was a gigantic middle finger aimed straight at the executive German car norm. Completely different in aesthetics, in what it focused on, which was comfort and refinement, just like the CX before it. The styling was outlandish. The hydropneumatic system, of course, sets it apart as well, nearly automatically. Yeah, it was a completely different proposition to what everyone else was doing at the time. That's a big fat check mark right there. And finally, did it have some Citroën quirks? Yes, they were subdued because, of course, by this time, Citroën didn't want to scare customers away. But the rear window had this concave shape, very unique. Some say it was to have better access to the boot. I don't know. It also had some very weird door bins. Very nice little Citroën touch. And it seems to be so nice that whenever I see people review the car, they can't stop fiddling with it. So that's a nice thing as well. Apart from that, it was a bit run-of-the-mill, to be honest with you. It had the centre console of a first generation Citroën C5. They had to save costs. But either way, I would still put a check mark there in the quirkiness. So that's a 3 out of 3. You don't get more proper Citroëns than the C6. What a car. If you've ever seen a channel called Up and Down, by the way, Mr. Kitch, the owner of the channel, he said that working on the C6 is a nightmare. Probably is. And he's probably going to sell his C6 because of the nightmare that it is to work on it. I watched that. I've seen it's a nightmare, and I still want one. God, it's a beautiful, wonderful... What a car. I want one. I want a 3-litre V6 HDI. So if anyone has a 3-litre V6 HDI C6 they don't fancy driving anymore, send it my way. For our next candidate, we travel to 2008, and it's my car, the C5X7. Yes, you might be saying, oh, look at him, he's putting his car for a year. Okay, fine. There is an element of self-centeredness about it, I do admit. But I think it's a cracking Citroën. First off, is it innovative? No, of course not. Not really. Because there's nothing new introducing this car. It's basically, if you were to be very cynical, you could say it was a Peugeot 508 with, you know, a different frock on. And it really doesn't introduce anything new. I can't really say there's something in this car that's like never before seen. The fixed hub and the steering wheel, that came from the C4, so it's not innovative there. But yeah, we move on to our next thing. Was it distinct from the competition? If it had a hydropneumatic system, then yes, automatically. But apart from that, not really. It was, of course, focused on comfort. In that respect, you can say it was very different from the competition. But I think by the mid-noughties, other cars weren't so different from the C5 as to be like, this is an order of magnitude more comfortable than other cars. I don't think that's the case at all, to be honest with you. But again, it did have the hydropneumatic system for those that had it. In my case, my first C5 didn't actually have it, but this one does. So yes, it's distinct from the competition. I'm going to put a check mark in that criterion. So yeah. And finally, did it have Citroën quirks? Well, yes, it did. The fixed center steering hub, that's a quirk. The saloons had that concave rear window. So it's a check mark there. I'm going to put it down as a proper Citroën. Next, another controversial one. The DS5. It was still a Citroën. This one's going to be very controversial. Some people will say it's not actually a Citroën. Well, it was when it came out. The DS5 was launched as a Citroën. It said Citroën on the back, even though it didn't say it on the steering wheel. It didn't really have that many double chevrons. But it was a weird car. Was it innovative? Of course, first. I don't know. It had a diesel hybrid system, which I'm not sure if that was the first car to have it or if Peugeot had it before. But either way, that was something unusual, and I don't remember seeing it on other cars. But we'll say no for the sake of this argument. Was it distinct from the competition? I would say very much so. It was sort of like an upmarket, oversized hatchback. It wasn't exactly, I would say, an estate. It wasn't a saloon. So it was very weird and very unique in that respect. And I don't think you could say there was anything like it at the time. I'm going to give it a check mark there for being distinct from the competition. Finally, did it have Citroën quirks? Well, it sort of did. If you look at the interior, the way it was all laid down, it was all very concept car-like. It looked very weird. And it had something that I've never seen before, which was individual windows above each passenger that you could control electrically operated blinds. I mean, if that's not a Citroën quirk, come on, what is? So I will put forward the Citroën DS5, even though it became another brand. I'll say that it's a proper Citroën. I'm sticking my neck out here, people. Finally, another controversial one. The Citroën C4 Cactus. Was it innovative? I think so. It's hard to, I mean, it had the air bumps on the side, so protection from dings and bumps and things like that. And I don't remember seeing it on any other car. So you can maybe chalk that as an innovation. Where it was innovative, and I don't think any other car before had that, was an airbag in the roof for the passenger, so you could free up the area in the dashboard for a second glove box. Or was it first glove box? I don't know. But that's an innovation. So I'm going to give it a checkbox there. It was very distinct from the competition, I think. I don't think any other car was like this. Maybe a Dacia, but I'm not sure. But I don't remember that. It was made to be very frugal, very light, very cheap to buy and cheap to run. So, for example, it didn't have windy down windows in the back. It had didn't have a split folding rear seat. It was a complete bench. It didn't have a rev counter. Small things like that to make the car lighter and cheaper to both build and to run. It also looked very weird. There were the air bumps as well. Again, something that set it apart. It had a very different kind of front fascia as well. So it was distinct from the competition. And did it have Citroën quirks? Maybe. I can't really remember that many. You know, apart from like putting the airbag in the ceiling, but that's an innovation. Was it a quirk as well? These things do bleed into one another. But I'm going to say no for the sake of this video. You know, I'm going to be conservative and I'm going to say no. But either way, that's still 2 out of 3. So the C4 Cactus, can put that down as a proper Citroën as well. So I did this list to show a couple of things. First, there are cars on the list that fulfill at least 2 of the 3 criteria that you wouldn't expect to be there. The C4, C4 Cactus, DS5, you'd think, you know, who cares about those cars? They're not exactly lauded in Citroën circles. On the other hand, there are cars that are not on the list that you'd probably expect to be there, even though they don't fulfill the criteria. I'm thinking of the Citroën AX. My wife doesn't think that's just, she has one by the way, she doesn't think it's just a proper Citroën. She thinks it's the ultimate Citroën. And she'd stab me in the face if I were to suggest that this was not a proper Citroën. And even in the case of my own BX, I had a Series 2, and if you take away the hydropneumatic suspension, then someone mean-spirited will say that that's just a Peugeot 405 with a hatchback and some chevrons on it. Yet I will fight to the hilt to defend the BX. I don't think it's just a proper Citroën. I think it's a proper car. I think it's one of the best cars ever made. And yeah, I did say that. I'll repeat that if you like. I think it's one of the best cars ever made. In fact, there was a phrase, I'm paraphrasing here, there was a Hungarian fan page I used to follow back in the day when I had my BX. And it said something along the lines of, there are two types of people, those who love BXs and those who have never driven one. And I stand by that 100%. So it just goes to show that really, and this is what I'm trying to get at with this video, a proper Citroën is a Citroën that its owner loves, that gives immense pleasure to its owner, that makes its owner happy. So the conclusion to the question that this video asked, what's the last proper Citroën, it might be a bit anticlimactic, because I think the answer is that there's no correct answer. Each Citroën fan is going to have their own opinion, and they're all valuable. If I can boast about my Citroën enthusiast credentials, I'm a second generation enthusiast. My father was before me, so I grew up around mostly CXs, but also 2CVs, Visas, BXs and the odd AMI 8, so I know my way around Citroëns. Yet, I don't think my opinion is any more or less valid than someone who truly likes Citroëns and began liking them just last week. And that's important, because no one likes a gatekeeper. So what is gatekeeping, you may ask, and why am I bringing it up? Well, gatekeeping, for those who don't know, in certain fandoms, it might be, you know, Star Wars or some band or cars, there are people who are called gatekeepers, and usually they're just huge enthusiasts, and they just want to show everyone else how incredibly knowledgeable and how much they love it more than anyone, and they will go to extreme lengths, such as telling other fans what is worthy and what is not worthy of praise. You know, that's not an agreeable attitude at all. In the case of Citroën, I want Citroën to thrive. I want Citroën to be able to one day make crazier cars than they do now. For that, they have to sell a lot. And that's why I'm bringing up gatekeeping. It's hard enough for Citroën to sell in large numbers if the perception of what people have of Citroën these days, I think they're French, unreliable, flaky cars, which they're not. And it doesn't help if there's a community of actual fans who badmouth everything that comes out, because they do. And this happened, for example, when the C6 came out. My God, there was a lot of venom sent the way of the C6. And when both generations of C5 came out, the first one because it was frumpy looking and it looked like it had been made by accountants, the second one because it looked German, etc. If you keep piling on hate on the actual brand that has the cars you love, it's going to go under, and we don't want that. So don't be a fundamentalist. Don't scare potential Citroën enthusiasts away. We need them. So that's sort of like the whole point of this video. Embrace Citroëns, even the ones that you think are not worthy of being Citroëns. They probably are. So that's this video. I hope you take from this that there are more proper Citroëns than you probably bargained for, and that's a good thing. And embrace it, because, you know, if they sell a lot, good. And that's what we want. We want Citroën to sell a lot, and then they're going to start making the really weird stuff that we like. That's the idea. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe and all that stuff. Visit comfortablecar.club for lovely car-themed t-shirts. And yeah, I bid you farewell. I hope to see you in a future video. Thanks very much for watching.